You're going to be looking this morning in John chapter 4. It's a very familiar story to everyone in this audience. It spans 45 verses, and so that means it's probably going to span 2 weeks for us in terms of lessons. For it's that story of Jesus as he visits with and encounters this Samaritan woman. And I'm glad you're here. I want to tell you that this lesson, and especially next week's lesson, I think will be very, very challenging. In fact, it may challenge long-held beliefs and long-held thoughts, but hopefully it will be a benefit. And what we always want for our assemblies is for it to be a blessing for everyone who attends here, everyone who listens at a distance. And I'm really glad you're here, and I hope it is a blessing for you this morning. But before I get into the story, I want to remind you of the films that are becoming increasingly popular called the Chosen films. Anybody here watch the Chosen films? Chosen are really, really good. They're produced down near Fort Worth. Season 1 has been completed. Susan and I have watched all of season 1. Season 2 has been completed. We've watched all of season 2. And now season 3 has been completed. We've watched a bit of season 3. And probably the best depiction of the life of Jesus that you could ever find anywhere. They're just outstanding. A friend of mine several months ago asked me to watch a live stream that followed one of these Chosen films. Now I have the app on my phone, so you can watch those on your phone if you want to. But the live stream that follows some of those films is an interview, or it's someone talking about what the Chosen film has meant to them. Months ago, this elder from a church in the Tulsa area said, "Ken, will you watch this and give me some feedback?" I never watched it. I couldn't find it. He asked a second time. I said, "No, I'm sorry, I haven't watched it." But last Sunday afternoon, I was with him and he said, "Have you watched it?" And I said, "No, I can't even find it." So he said, "Give me your phone," and he showed me how to find it. So I watched it this week. One night this week, I watched this, what I would call trailer or live stream following the film. It was hard to watch. It was about a woman named Megan. And Megan had, as a little tiny girl, been sold into sex trafficking in this country. And that continued through her teen years. It continued into her 20s. Twice she escaped. And 2 different times she ended up with church people in churches. But she said it never worked because they immediately tried to force me into a lifestyle that I couldn't comprehend. But it wouldn't have worked anyway because those who owned her retrieved her and forced her back into this abusive world. Dark, horrible, abusive world. A third time she got away. And this time she found some Christian women who didn't try to change anything. They were kind. They were accepting. And little by little, they encouraged her, and they began to show her the Chosen films. And she said, "I began to see something about Jesus I'd never seen before, and began to make, from that, major changes in her life." Now, the story ends really badly because from all those years of abuse, she was sick, and she had a disease, and she died. But from that which I watched this week, I found 2 principles. And Bert's going to put each one on the screen, and then going to put them together. What I have learned from that is you have to be received before you can be redeemed. Received before redemption. The second is grace before truth. You have to have grace extended before you'll listen to truth. Now, I should have known all that, because all through the New Testament, had I been paying attention, there's story after story of that. I'll give you one illustration. You remember as children we learned about a man who was short of stature? And you remember that he too was literally despised by everyone? He was a tax collector. He was a thief. He was hated. But he learned that Jesus was coming to town, and so in order to see over the crowd, you remember what he does? He climbs up the tree. And as Jesus comes by, Jesus looks up and he says, Zacchaeus, I'm going to go home with you. Now, isn't that an interesting way to start a conversation? And isn't that a shocking way for a man like Jesus to say to a despised, reprobate, tax collector, thief, I'm going to go to your house? And we have no idea all that took place at that house. We only know that after Zacchaeus comes forth and says, I'm done with all that. I'm going to restore to everyone I've taken things illegally from, and I'm going to restore it 2 and 3 and 4-fold. I'm going to make everything right. But what you learn in the story is from Jesus that Jesus received him before there was redemption that could take place. And there was grace before there was truth. Now, those are principles that are exactly played out in John chapter 4. It's exactly the same story of John chapter 4. Now, I'm going to tell you most of the story of John chapter 4, at least for this week's portion, because I got to watch the time. I'm going to tell you most of the story. When we get to that critical part, Burke will begin to put some scriptures up on the screen. But if you're reading in the text, you'll find in verse 1 that Jesus has been found by the Pharisees. From last week, you remember that he's been out in the Judean countryside, and he, his disciples, and he have been baptizing. Although it says in this text in John chapter 4, only his disciples were doing the baptizing, not Jesus. But the Pharisees have found him. So he decides to go to Galilee. And normally a Jew would go around the country of Samaria, take the long road around the country of Samaria in order to get to Galilee. But Jesus takes his disciples and they go right through the country of Samaria. Now you have to understand that Jews and Samaritans literally hate each other. And it's kind of interesting because they have the same skin color. And it's kind of interesting because they have similar heritage. Because they trace themselves all the way back to Solomon. When Solomon died, he handed over the reins of his kingdom to his son Rehoboam. And Rehoboam, you remember, is young and he's foolish. And the kingdom under Rehoboam divides. And the northern kingdom, 10 tribes to the north, they have a king named Jeroboam. He's bad. And every single king to the north is bad. They get worse over time. Until finally God says enough. And he sends the Assyrians. And the Assyrians annihilate them as a nation. Now that does not mean that every Jew was killed. So the Assyrians and some of the Jews began to intermarry. And they were half Assyrian and they were half Jew. And they became Samaritans. And the Jews to the south, they didn't like them at all. It's kind of like a country that has civil war. It may be a member of the family on one side and another member of the family on the other side, and they just can't stand each other. So the Jew looks at the Samaritan as a half-breed, inferior, totally inferior, despise, won't talk to them. And the Samaritans feel the same way about the Jews. And Jesus has made his way through Samaria. And he comes to a city called Sychar. Now that too has history to it, because that is a plot of land that Jacob had originally given to his son Joseph. Now, you're talking about a long time ago. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons. And Jacob has that favored son, Joseph. And he gives to Joseph this piece of land. And now they have a Samaritan city there on Jacob's land, now Joseph's land. And outside the city, they have a well that had been dug by Jacob, a deep well of pure water. And Jesus goes to the well because it says in the story, he's really tired. He's really weary. Where are his disciples? It says in the story that they've gone into the city of Sychar to get some food. So you see the humanity of Jesus. Some of you were there this week. You were tired. You were worn out. He's thirsty. He's hungry. And he's sitting there all by himself by the well. And here comes a woman. Here comes a Samaritan woman. It's noontime. And everybody who reads the story and talks about the story says that is a clue that something is wrong. That she is coming by herself at noontime. Because the way it usually works is that the women come together early in the morning and they draw the water that they'll need for the day. It's a time when the women can visit with each other. They can talk about their children. They can complain about their husbands. They can do anything that all you women do when you get together. I don't know if Steve will remember or not, but when Grandpa had that general store out at Cowden, out behind the general store was a laundry. And no clothes dryers, just the washing machines, the kind that had the old wringers, and most of them were hand wringers. And I can remember as a little boy going out and watch the women put bluing in the water. And all those women would come on Mondays. They would come on Mondays and they would do all their laundry together. It was visit time. It was social time. This woman doesn't get to come with other women. You know why? Because Samaritans have principles too. Samaritans have religion too. Samaritans have values too. And what you're going to learn about this woman is, for some reason, she's been married 5 times and she's living with a man now who's not her husband. We don't know why. Can I just tell you that not everyone chooses to be held in bondage of sin? Not everyone chooses that. Sometimes factors enter in beyond one's choice that force them into a lifestyle that they don't want to live. Do you understand that? And sometimes there are addictions that get in our lives that we can't seem to get rid of. I don't think the woman probably wants to come by herself at noon. She doesn't like being the outcast. So she arrives at the well. Now, normally, what would a Jewish man do when a Samaritan woman comes? And by the way, Jesus is all human, and he's weary, and he is tired, but he knows exactly everything about this woman. He knows already everything about this woman. And he'll know that text a little bit later where she's been married 5 times and the man she's living with now is not her husband. He knows all about that. And normally, a Jew knowing something like that would turn his back and stomp away, saying ugly words as he left. What does Jesus do? Ma'am, could you give me a drink of water? Would you be willing to give me a drink of water? She can hardly believe it. And she will respond and say, you are a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How is it that you can ask me for a drink of water? You're not supposed to be talking to me. You're supposed to be treating me really badly. This is not how it works. Now I want you to look at the part of the story that really becomes valuable in terms of what Jesus teaches the woman. And Bert's going to put that on the screen for you. Because Jesus answered her and said, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Now you see how this is all playing out? You see the kindness? Not only is he speaking to her, not only does he ask her for a favor, a drink of water, but now he's saying, if you would just ask me, I would give you something even more than water. I would give you living water. And it continues. The woman's a little confused. Sir, this well is pretty deep. You don't even have anything to put water in. How are you going to get water out of that well that you call living water? This is not going to work. So Jesus responds, everyone who drinks the water that I give them will never be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them, they're going to be different. It's going to be wonderful. Now, how would you feel if someone told you that? If you were an outcast, if you were despised, if you were lonely, if you were miserable, and in the heat of the day you've been coming every day to draw all the water for what you need for the day. And this strange Jew is being really kind and says, I'm going to give you some water. If you drink this water, you'll never thirst again. This water will even give you eternal life. This water will well up inside of you and give you eternal life. How would you feel? How would you respond to all that? Well, look at the practicality, how she responds. Look at what happens next. Sir, give me some of this water so that I won't get thirsty anymore, and I won't have to keep coming here to get this water. I won't have to keep going through this. Give me some of this water. Now that's where Jesus is going to say, okay, but will you go get your husband first? Now, we'll pick up there next week. But we'll pick up there next week. But I want you to see something that happens. At the end of the story, you know what she does? She goes racing back into the city. And she says, I think I found the Messiah. I think I found the one who's supposed to come. Now, isn't that interesting for a Samaritan village to hear about the Messiah? But they had heard about the Messiah because they had heritage that stretched all the way back to Solomon, and before Solomon to Joseph, and before Joseph to Jacob, and before Jacob to Abraham. They knew the stories. They knew about Moses. They were just different from the Jews. There was hostility between them, and there was hatred between them. And people will come with her, even though she is the outcast. People will come to see Jesus. And everything's going to change in this woman's life before we get through. But do you see why it changed? Do you see it how it changed? Go back to the two principles. Jesus welcomed her or received her before they ever got close to words of redemption. And Jesus was filled with grace and kindness, loving kindness toward her, before he ever talked to her about water that would keep her alive throughout eternity. Before he ever began to reveal who he was, he talked to her as though she were a human being. For years, I have told audiences I have 9 principles about people. I give them my 9 principles. But of the 9, I always say every single person is really, really important. And I always say that every single person is really, really special. And you may look around you, as I look around myself at times, and see people, and you may think, how do they get like that? And you may not be very attracted to them. But I've got to tell you something. They are important too. They are important too. And they are special too. Don't you remember my old story? My old story years and years ago of walking up to a church building in Clarendon, Texas, getting there really early on a Sunday morning, and standing out on the porch way too early was one of their elders, and 2 men also very short in stature. One was named John and the other named Glenn. And John had the condition of Down syndrome. He had a Bible. It's one of these big family table Bibles like we used to have when I was a kid, under his arm. And he was trying to tell me something. I don't know what he was trying to tell me. Finally, this elder said, he's trying to tell you he wants to be a preacher. And the elder said, Ken, and we'd never met before, he said, Glenn also has mental issues because Glenn had a chemical deficiency at birth, and back in that day they didn't know to check for it, and had they been checked for it, it would have given the mother an injection, all would have been fine, but he never matured physically, never matured mentally. I walk in the church building that morning, and I'm standing in the back just surveying things and seeing where I'm supposed to be, and here's John walking back and forth, and John's preaching. I guess that's what their preacher did, because he's preaching. I drove back to Lubbock, 3-hour drive that night, and I took a Bible out of our bookshelf, and it was a modern speech version. I took it back and gave it to John. The next 2 nights, he'd walk up to me and say, shake that Bible, thank you, buddy, thank you, buddy. But the last night, a little lady came to me. I don't know how old she was. I thought really old. Probably my age, but probably I thought she was really old. She said, I want to thank you for giving John the Bible. Glenn didn't belong to her. John belonged to her. And then she said this, they are human too. Words of a mother. They are human too. And what I'd like for us to understand is, I get really disgusted. And I tell you about it all the time. I'm disgusted with the way this world's going. I'm disgusted with the sinfulness of this world. And I'm even angry about it sometimes. But I can tell you that every single person in this world is special. And God wants them to be saved. Before they ever will be saved, though, they need to be received before they'll ever get the redemption. And they got to experience grace, kindness, before they ever will get to listen to truth. And that might take longer than you and I want to give. But I'll tell you something. I've been really impressed with all of you. Because what I've been seeing over the last year and 2 years is a group of people who seem to inherently know and have learned these principles. And you're willing to receive people and be gracious to people who are very different from us and be kind to them so that they get to hear at some point the living water speech. The living water speech that allows us to drink of the living water so we never thirst again. That's who Jesus was. That's what Jesus did. And we are redeemed today because Jesus died for us. And we're redeemed today because before he died for us, he acted like that.